Today we're going to be learning Shekalim Daf Yud. We're going to start from the beginning of the 4th chapter at the bottom of Terem Bet, the Mishnah. Hatruma ma yosimba. We would have thought this would have started the Masechet, which is once we know we have, or at least toward the beginning, once we have the machatzira shekel that we know we have to bring, what is that money used for? So the money is used to buy, for some reason we have this only in the 4th chapter, but we'll start here. The money is used to buy Tmidim Musafim, the Korbanot Tamid, the daily sacrifices that were brought twice a day, the Musafim, the extra ones for the holidays, Nischehem, all the extra libations that go along with the sacrifices. HaOmer, Ushte Alechem, the Korban HaOmer, the one that was brought on the 16th of Nisan, which was brought from the barley crop, the new crop, Ushte Alechem, and the 2 breads that were brought with the Shavuot sacrifice, Vilechem HaPanim, and the bread that was brought every week, that was put on the shulchan, and then the Kohanim ate it. V'kol korbanot hatzibur, and all public offerings. Shomrei svichim b'shvi'i notlim schara mitrumat halishka. When it was the Shemitah year, the problem is they had to bring a bunch of the sacrifices from the new crop. Both the Omer and the Shtei Alechem have to come from new crop from Israel. So what would they do? They would have to hire people. Where would it come from if they weren't planting? So there was stuff that grew in the wild that is allowed to be eaten. So they would have to make sure that so they had to hire guards to watch the wild produce that people didn't eat it, that we had enough for the offering. So they would get their salary from the Trumat HaLishka. Later, we're going to see how exactly this was paid. How did they pay the salary when the money was sanctified? The money you have to remove the sanctity from the money. How exactly did that work? We'll get to that in the Gemara. Rabbi Yossi Omer, if somebody wants to, they can volunteer for this job. They can say, oh, I'll do this for free for the temple. That's totally fine. Amrulo, the rabbi said to him, no, they can't work for free. That's a problem if they work for free. Afata Omer, she'ein ba'in ela mishel tzibur. No, even you would say, or you should say that the korbanot, everything has to be only things that are communal. Now, if we have people who are working and they're watching things for free, then they have some sort of ownership rights. Now, we'll actually explain this in 2 different ways. Either they have some sort of ownership rights to the produce, which means that when we bring the sacrifice, it's not brought from public funds, it's actually brought from, they have certain ownership rights to it. The other issue is really a bit of a different way of looking at it, which is we want these communal offerings to be communal. Everybody equal. We already learned the machatzira shekel. Everybody's equal. Now, if I do work for the temple, I'm going to think that this is a little bit more for me, right? I have more rights to it because I worked for it. I did something for it for free. Right? It's just like a certain type of entitlement almost, that if I do something for free, right? We all know nobody does anything for free. You do something for free, it's true, but you somewhat have a certain amount of entitlement or rights to it in a certain way of, right? This is classic. If somebody volunteers for something, they specifically because they don't get paid, sometimes they feel they have a certain ability to have, how would you say, to determine things, right? In other words, I've given my time for free, that gives me certain rights. So it's not always the case, but it could be the case. So therefore, we don't want that type of thing. These communal offerings, we want to be totally equal, everyone in the same place. And therefore, it can't possibly be that they could work for free, and therefore we have to pay them. It's a very interesting issue. So the Gemara starts off and says, okay, so now, how could it be? We're now going to talk about that there were certain people who did certain jobs in the temple. And in fact, they would have a certain celebration. Okay, we're going to have a bit of a discussion about some involvement. Rabbi Yossi thinks that people could do things for free. And now we're going to talk about a Masechet Ta'anit. Okay, there's a Mishnah in Ta'anit, which talks about 9 days that people were called the Zmanei Atzei Kohanim Va'am, where they would bring a special sacrifice, which had wood that was brought from this korban nedava. So they explain now about this issue. Why were these days special? There was a time when the people came up from the exile and they didn't have any wood. And what happened? So people came. voluntarily brought wood from their own possession. They didn't take money for it. And they did the korbanot zibor with them, the public offerings. And the Nevi'im that were among them said, they made a promise to them, even if everything is full of wood, they have a lot of wood in the temple, but these people bring, and it's from then on, even if there's no need anymore, but they bring to the temple, they have first dibs there, okay, not to make their sacrifices, but their wood gets to be used first on the altar. So what do you see here, right? You see, so now we're going to see that this must be, okay, we're now going to see, who does this opinion work with? Must work with Rabbi Yossi, who thinks that individuals can give their own donations, right? This is like two approaches. One is saying be wary of volunteers, and the other one is saying it's great. We need to encourage volunteers. And yeah, we'll give them whatever they want. The Nevi'im said, we'll promise you yours will be first, okay? Even though, right, there's a certain element of they get ownership over it almost, right? The sacrifice they brought from their wood, that already means that this isn't exactly korbanot zibor, or maybe it will be, we're going to see. So first the Gemara says about this, Amar Rabbi Acha, De Rabbi Yossi, this must be according to Rabbi Yossi, this part. To Rabbi Yossi Omer, because he says if they want, they can watch the svichim, the wild crops, for free. So here it sounds like the same. Rabbi Yossi b'shem Rabbi Ilah says no, divrei hakoli. He says no. This is according to everybody. Ma pligin, what's the machloket? And when do they have a machloket in our Mishnah? That's begufo shel korban. That's when it comes to the sacrifices. Aval b'machshirei korban kol amamode shu mishtane korban yachid, the korban zibor. But when it comes to the wood and things that are serving the needs of the sacrifice, but not the sacrifice itself, everybody agrees that you can take something individual and use it for the public. That's not the same. Our Mishnah was talking about the sacrifices itself can't have, right here we're bringing, it's what you're bringing the sacrifice from, the barley, whatever it is, right? That, or the wheat, that's what's important, but not, that can't be done by an individual. But things like the wood, which is just allowing wood to burn so that we can bring sacrifice, that's already removed. That anyone can do, even Chachamim, the rabbis, would agree. Tani, another case. Isha she'asta ketonat levana kshera. This is the Kohen Gadol. His mother would sometimes make him a special clothing that he would wear. So if his mother made him a ketonat levana, it's kshera. It's all fine. He can wear something that his mother made on her own and donated to the temple. As long as she says, I'm giving this to the public, it becomes public property. But even if she made it herself and donated of her own funds, that's fine. So here you see the same thing. Amar Rabbi Acha, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yossi Amar, Farot 7, and David Shomer Chinam. Sounds exactly like our Mishnah, but only according to Rabbi Yossi. Again, to which Rabbi Yossi, B'Shem Rabbi Ilah, is a different Rabbi Yossi, says Divrei HaKolhi. Right? It's everyone agrees. Why? Because Mapagina begufo shel korban, abba machshirei korban kol amamode shu mishtane korban yachid, the korban sibor. Again, we're going to differentiate between the sacrifice itself and things that are serving the needs of the sacrifice. Whereas what the Kohen wears is not exactly the sacrifice; it's just serving the needs of the sacrifice. Manita plige al Rabbi Yossi. Now we're going to bring a braita that disagrees with Rabbi Yossi. Okay, this is the Rabbi Yossi that we've been saying now that says Divrei HaKol, not the Rabbi Yossi in our Mishnah, but the Rabbi Yossi who says Divrei HaKol. Oh, actually, it's my mistake. It says here, Manita Pliga Rabbi Yossi, but actually they change it. If you look, there's a bet there, and it goes to the Haggadah Gra, and he says it should be, right? It should be Manita Pliga al Rabbi Acha, right? Some people say it's Pliga Rabbi Acha, which is actually Misayel Rabbi Chia. So there's different versions here. Some people say actually, Misayel Rabbi Yossi, that it supports Rabbi Yossi, again, who thinks that this is going to support the fact that we differentiate between the korban and machshirei korban. So how so? Otan yamim nuhagim b'shat korban v'shelo b'shat korban. Now we go back to the fact that they would make these certain holidays. Each family, okay, there was a family that donated wood, and the day that they donated the wood, there was a particular day of year that they were in charge of donating wood. That day, their family would have a particular holiday. Now it says, there's a machloket here. Are these days that they made into a holiday, the day that they donated wood to the temple, According to the first reason, the first opinion, Tanakama, Nohagim b'shat korban v'shelo b'shat korban. This is whether the time of the temple or whether it's not the time of the temple. Even beyond the temple times, this family still continued to have a holiday on that day. This is only when there was a temple around, Rabbi Yossi says. And furthermore, it says, actually, some people take out these words and it really just continues this braita. Amar Rabbi Elazar be Rabbi Tzadok. Anu hayinu mibnei Sna'a ben Binyamin. We were from the family of Sna'a ben Binyamin. It was one of those families, and they had a holiday on the 10th of Av, the day after Tisha B'Av. V'chal Tisha B'Av liyot b'Shabbat. On a particular year, Tisha B'Av came out on Shabbat, which meant that the 10th of Av was actually the fast. V'dachinu oto l'motzei Shabbat. We had to push off Tisha B'Av till Motzei Shabbat. V'hayinu mitanim v'lo mashlimim. We would fast, but we wouldn't finish the fast because it was also a holiday for us. So what do you see here? You see that they continued to sell, that all the opinions, it's just a debate about when, at the first two opinions really, debate about whether you do it in the time of the temple or not in the time of the temple, but everybody agrees that these were holidays for them. And then the real issue becomes, right, that it's still a holiday, which means that, that even the rabbis agree that there's a holiday here for this, which means that we accept these individual donations according to everybody, right? Everyone seems to agree, even those who would disagree with Rabbi Yossi here. You see the rabbis disagreeing with Rabbi Yossi. It's the same Rabbi Yossi as in our Mishnah. So you see that even the rabbis who disagree with him agree that this is a holiday, that people could bring individual offerings to the temple, and therefore you see that that's the case. Again, they disagreed about whether it's time of the temple, not time of the temple, but clearly in the time of the temple they did bring, and they made a holiday out of it. So therefore they all agree. The Od, Minha, I went back by accident. Ha'omer. Okay, now we're up to the next line of the Mishnah. Ha'omer u'shtei alechem v'lechem ha'panim v'chol korbanot hatzibur. Okay, the next words you see in your text are in parentheses, so we're not going to read them. Taman taninan, we're going to quote a Mishnah that says, Kol korbanot ha'yachiv hatzibur ba'im min ha'aretz u'min chutz ha'aretz. Okay, according to Tanakama, all the korbanot, the individual and the public offerings, can be brought from the land of Israel or from outside the land of Israel. And if you need to bring flour, let's say, it can be brought from afar. Mina chadash umina yashan, it can be brought from the new crop or from the old crop. Chutz mina omer u'shtei alechem she'ein ba'in ela mina chadash u'mina aretz. Except for the omer and the shtei alechem, those two have to be brought from the new crop and from the land of Israel. Okay, now what this means, and by the way, all have to be brought from the new crop, but the point is, okay, not exactly that. Let me explain it. The mincha, what the mincha offering does, and I want to explain just for a minute, the omer and the shtei alechem, what they do. You would bring the barley, the new barley crop for the omer, and that would permit everybody outside the temple to eat and use the new grains that grew that year. The shtei alechem was another relating to chadash also. That would then permit all offerings brought in the temple to now be brought from the new crop. Until then, even though it says Be'emin HaChadash, Be'emin HaYashan, it means that anything can be brought from the old crop, that's for sure. The new crop, it can only be brought in the temple for the Omer, and then after that, only after the Shtei Alechem. The Shtei Alechem permitted the new crop to be brought in the temple. But the point is that you can also bring the old crop. Once you can bring the new crop, you can also use the old crop for all your sacrifices. But the Shtei Alechem and the Omer have to specifically brought from the new crop because each of them is symbolic of, again, the Omer that now we permitted outside the temple, and then the Shtei Alechem now we permitted inside the temple. And they have to be brought specifically from Israel. Rav Huna, B'Shem Rabbi Yirmiyah says, by the way, to Rabbi Yishmael, this is only Rabbi Yishmael. The Rabbi Yishmael Omer, Ein HaOmer Ba Mina Syria. You can't bring it from Syria, right, Syria, and not from anywhere else. Taman Tanina, another halacha. Right? And this is where we get, this is just going more in depth about the Omer and the Shtei Alechem and what they can be brought from and what's the difference between them and other sacrifices. Taman Tanina, okay, also says in a Mishnah in Kelim, Eser Kedushatim. There's 10 sanctities. Eretz Yisrael mekudeshet mikol ha'aratzot, umay kedushata, what makes Israel, the land of Israel, sanctified? Shemevi'im mimena ha'omer va'abikurin u'shtei alechem. Ma she'en mevi'im ken mikol ha'aratzot. There's another source that seems to say the same thing, that the Omer and the Shtei Alechem and the Bikurim have to be brought from the crop of the land, whereas other things don't. This, by the way, comes from Psukim. It says there, you have to bring them in Chakadashah. It says, Mi moshvotechem, and they darsha moshvotechem. There's a debate about B'diavad. If you, yes, ideally you're supposed to bring them from the land. What if you didn't bring them from the land? There's a debate about whether this is okay, whereas Rabbi Yishmael says it's not okay, right? There he specifically says, Ein ha'omer ba min asulia, whereas others think, ideally you should, but if you brought it from somewhere else, it actually works also. Okay, so now right? These can't be brought from any other land. Rabbi Chia b'shem Rabbi Yirmiyah again says to Rabbi Yishmael, this is Rabbi Yishmael's opinion, to Rabbi Yishmael Amal, Ein ha'omer ba min asulia. Okay, so now we've established Rabbi Yishmael's opinion. We've seen it now in two different places where they attributed those Mishnayot to Rabbi Yishmael. Taman Tanina, and another Mishnah. Rabbi Yishmael Omer, Macharish Reshut, Af Ketzir Reshut. Yatzak Ketzira Omer Shehu Mitzvah. Just like, okay, there's a famous pasuk called where it says B'charishu b'katzir tishbot. It's actually in the context of holidays, and then it says Shesh Yamim Tavod. And then it says, I have to read the rest of the pasuk. Let me see if it's here. No, why don't they bring it here? 1 second. Okay, I didn't check it. Let me go find it 1 second. I'll open the Tanakh. Okay, I got my Tanakh. Here we go. It's Shmod Lamed Daled pasuk. Pasuk. Just lost it here. Pasuk Kaf Aleph. Sheshet Yamim Tavodu Vayom HaShvi'i Tishbot. You should stop working on the seventh day. B'charishu b'katzir tishbot. You should stop doing charisha, plowing, and you should stop reaping. Okay, now there's a debate about this verse. Is this referring to Shabbat specifically, or is it referring to the Shemitah year and that you shouldn't work in the Shemitah year? So there happens to be a debate about this and how we understand this verse. So now our Gemara is going to say, Rabbi Yishmael Omer, okay, Rabbi Yishmael Omer, Macharish Reshut, Af Ketzir Reshut. There's no such thing as plowing for the purposes of a mitzvah. So therefore, they say when it says B'chatzir Tishbot, it means that you can't, and they understand it now to be referring to Shabbat. You can't reap on Shabbat if it's Ksir Reshut, but Yatzak Ksir Omer Shi Mitzvah. And Rabbi Yishmael says, okay, that you can harvest the crops on Shabbat. Okay, if you need to harvest it for the sacrifice of the Omer for a mitzvah, you're allowed to do that on Shabbat. So now they connect between this and the other opinion. Rabbi Yishmael Kidate. Rabbi Yishmael Amal, Ein ha'omer ba min asuria, and Kidate de Amar Yatzak Tzira Omer Shehi Mitzvah. This section is a little bit troublesome. It's not exactly clear what's the connection between these two things. So there are some who explain that the connection is that some people say that yes, ideally it's supposed to be brought from Israel, but you can also bring it not. And yes, ideally it's supposed to be cut on the 16th, but if the 16th falls on Shabbat, then you're not allowed to cut. Comes Rabbi Yishmael to say, no, those two mitzvot are critical. You have to do it on the 16th, so therefore it's going to override Shabbat if the Shabbat comes out on the 16th. And number two, you have to bring it from the land, and therefore it's not going to be kasher if it comes from Syria. Other explanations given, but we'll leave it at that. It's a bit of a problematic line because the connection between those two is not exactly so clear. So now who's the one who says that these shomrei svichim on the Shvi'it take their salary from the Trumat HaLishka? So they say, Rabbi Yishmael, it must be Rabbi Yishmael. Why? Because if you hold that b'diavad, that we don't have to, if you don't have crops from here, you could take it from outside the land, then you don't need people to watch it. So therefore, we're going to assume that our Mishnah, Rabbi Yossi, who said, is it Rabbi Yossi? No, the Mishnah, I think it was just the Mishnah, right? Yeah, just the Mishnah, the simple Mishnah that said they get their, we need to hire people to make sure we have from the land. That must be connected because the Omer has to come from the land. That's Rabbi Yishmael's opinion. Now we understand why we brought up Rabbi Yishmael here. But Amar Rabbi Yosef, Tivrei Kol hu he. No, really everybody agrees because this is a good approach, or not a good approach. This is a good example of the approach of some people, which some people will say is a good approach, which is, some people might say, don't go with this approach, but you always have to, especially when you're talking about the Korban HaOmer, we have to make sure that we have crops. So if it's the Shemitah year and we're worried we're not going to have, it's true we could rely to get from Syria if we have to, if we're in a pinch, but what if they don't have? What if something happened to their crops? We don't want to be stuck. So yes, it's worth it for the temple to hire people to watch what we have, the ones growing wild, so that we don't end up stuck without it. But it's not necessarily Rabbi Yishmael. It could be according to the opinion that it's okay. Okay. Hahen Omer Maushi is Rabitchila. So now they say, wait, well, if it's so important to have it from the land, can you plant it on the Shemitah year? So right, you're not allowed to plant on the Shemitah year, but maybe for the purposes of a mitzvah, just like you're not allowed to reap on Shabbat, but for the purposes of a mitzvah, we allow it. So maybe you can. So he asked before Rabbi Mana, Lo nimtza ki kometz al shirayim she'enan ne'achalim. Isn't this like kometz al shirayim that you can't eat, which is you're not allowed to bring. Okay, now the omer is a mincha offering, meal offerings. What would happen is the kohen would do a kmitza, which is he takes his 3 middle fingers, he dips them in, okay, scrapes off the sides with his 2 side fingers, and then that part gets burnt on the altar. Whatever's left gets eaten. That's what we were saying before about the stuff that got eaten. Now, according to what we're going to see, it says, isn't it true that kometz al shirayim she'enan nechalim, you're doing a kmitza on shirayim that can't be eaten? Normally the shirayim get eaten. And if you do it like this, we can't, it's true, we might be allowed to plant, but we're not allowed to eat. So wouldn't that be a problem? So we actually saw this in Masechet Pesachim on Daf Ayin Vav, which is there's 5 things that we allow them to be brought even though it's tamei. Okay, Tumah Hutra B'tzibur, if you remember. We allow sacrifices to be brought b'tumah in certain circumstances, but they can't be eaten. Remember, Pesach was the one exception. That even though we bring it b'tumah, since the main point of the korban is to eat it, therefore we're allowed to eat it even though we brought it b'tumah. But normally, if we tumah hutra b'tzibur, it doesn't allow it to be eaten. And yet we could bring the sacrifice even though it can't be eaten. So likewise here, we could bring the mincha even though the shirayim can't be eaten. So this would be an exception to that rule. And even though normally you'd have to eat, it would be the shirayim would have to be eaten. In this case, it's okay if they're not. And yes, it sounds like you could plant if you needed it, if you didn't have any other crop. Now we want to go back to paying these people. How exactly do we pay them? Okay, this becomes a halachic issue, which is, again, the money from the Truma Lishka is hekdesh. You can't just pay people from hekdesh. I was thinking it's like an amuta in Israel. If you have a non-for-profit, I'm sure it's like that in America also, you need to show all your receipts. So you can't just hire someone, like let's say our shul wants to hire a babysitter on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. So they can't hire a babysitter and pay someone out of pocket in cash, right? And they can pay in cash. They can't pay from the bank account because they need a receipt for it, right? What they'll generally do is, which is a little, a bit of an issue, everything really has to be recorded on the books. So you don't really want to pay off the books. So it's a problem. How do you hire a babysitter and not record it in the books? Because you need a receipt. So it's likewise here. It's similar. You need some sort of, it's not documentation exactly, but when you pay that money, the money has to transfer the sanctity to something else. So we have a bit of a problem because if they pay the money straight to the people who are the shomrim, the money will be hekdesh. It needs to, and then they can't do anything with that money. So how do we do that? Because remember, when you give the money to the Trumat Halishka, to the Beit HaMikdash, it becomes sanctified. Normally you use it to buy the animal. So what happens? The kedusha, the sanctity goes on to the animal and the money is now free. But in this case, you're paying someone's salary. It doesn't work that way. So what would they do? No telma omin ashulchani. They would get paid up front from a money lender or a money trader, the people who traded the monies. We saw that before about the kalbon, and there were the money people. So they take money on loan. Okay, the temple takes money on loan from a shulchani. No telma kotzlinu l'shomrim. So you give it to those who reap. It's also the reapers. It's not just the people watching and the guards. Until you bring the omer sacrifice. Then when you bring it, in other words, when you cut the omer and you bring it to the temple, you take money from the temple and you trade it for the omer. So the sanctity of the money goes onto the omer. That's how it works. So now you take the omer becomes sanctified, and then it's the barley crop. So that becomes holy. Vitavut ken, and that's a good way to do it. Okay, so then what happens? Then you take, it doesn't really spell this out, but what you would do is you would take the money. Now, before we get to Tavut Ken, I'll get back to that in a minute. But then, so once you did that, and then the money becomes not sanctified anymore, you would take that money and return it to the Shulchani. Now the Gemara asks, Tavut Ken, is this a good solution? It's a bit of a problem here because, right, then I think this is already the answer. I think Tavut Ken is already the whole question. It doesn't really express the problem, but what's the problem? The problem is that if I work as a guard on that field, I work to guard a huge field. In the end, we just used a very small amount of crops. So how can they pay me money that's a large sum of money when in the end, all they're getting is a small amount of barley? It's not worth it, right? It's not the same amount of money for what I did. I did a job that was much bigger than what the temple actually needed. So how can the temple pay me such a large amount when in the end, right, they're redeeming this money onto, a few stalks of barley? It just seems odd. It doesn't seem to match up. So what do they say? Rabbi Acha b'shem Rabbi Ba, kol ma she'yiten hein hein damav misha'a rishona. In other words, whatever they give me, that's the value of it. In other words, yes, sometimes for a lot, right, only for a small amount, we need to work a lot. I need to guard that whole field to ensure that I have in the end whatever amount of barley they need, even if it's not a lot. So even though I worked for more than just the amount of barley they got, the value of my work was actually valued very high because I had to take care of that entire field just so that we make sure that we have barley. That's one way of understanding it. Some people actually understand this a little differently, but we'll stick with one interpretation. Tana, it's the exact same thing, by the way, with the stone workers, okay, who hew the stone and carve it and sand it down, shape it for building in the temple. It's the exact same thing. What do they do? Again, they get paid from the money lender. They give it to the hewers and to the stone workers until they use it for when they actually bring the stones into the temple and put it in their place. Once it's actually used, then they redeem the coins onto the value of the stone. Right? And then again, they ask, does this make any sense? Rabbi Yossi, baby Rabbi Boon, B'Shem Shmuel says, yes, again, yes, even though they didn't use all the stones that I took care of, but in the end, I had to take care of all those stones in order to get to where we wanted to. New Mishnah. Now we're going to talk about what we do with the money. We take the money from the Trumat HaLishkan. There's a bunch of different ways to understand this Mishnah. But we take the money from the Trumat HaLishkan. Again, 3 times a year, they would take the money. We've learned already this, right? They would take it, and then they would spend the money on sacrifices. Whatever was left, they would cover it up. And then the question is, what do they do with what's left there? Now, some people say it means after each of the 3 times. Some people say we mean when you're done with the last one only, because maybe those collect together and still we're using them for korbanot. But what if there's money left over? So after we buy all of our sacrifices, let's say after the 3rd holiday, we still have money left over. We bought our animals. Now it could be you still might need more money for more animals, right? We think we bought all the animals we need, but maybe we'll need more. We'll see. Again, they knew kind of what communal offerings there were. We're not talking about individual offerings. So in any case, the question is, what can we do with this money at this point now that it's left over? The first 3 are things that are bought from, besides sacrifices, there's a few other things that are Torah law, and those can be bought from the money up front. The same time you're buying the animals, you can buy the following: a para aduma, the seir mishtalech, the seir, right? These are not brought as sacrifices, but they're used for the temple needs, right? The para to purify people, the seir mishtalech for that's the seir, the goat, the scapegoat of Yom Kippurim that gets thrown off a cliff. Lashon shel zehorit. This is, they would put this into the para aduma waters. They would drop a lashon of zehorit. It was part of the, not into the water. They would put a lashon of zehorit. They would wrap it around the ezov, the hyssop, and they would put it into burn. When they burnt the para aduma, they would put this inside to burn. So these are bought with the temple funds. Kevesh para, kevesh seir mishtalech, v'lashon sheben karnav, v'amat hamayim, v'chomot ha'ir u'migdoloteha, v'chol tzorchei ha'ir ba'im mishayrei ha'lishka. Now we get to the leftover money. If we bought all these things already, then what do we use the leftovers for? For this ramp that they built for the para aduma. When they walked out from the Har HaBayit, they would walk from the Temple Mount to the Mount of Olives, and they would bring the para aduma there, and that's where they would burn it. They didn't want there to be any tumah, so they built a special bridge that made sure that if there was tumah in the ground underneath, it wouldn't get onto the bridge, and therefore there would be no tumah around. You have to be very careful with the para aduma that para doesn't get tameh, and the people working with it don't become tameh while they're doing it. And then this whole thing about people do become tamei, but that's after. So they built this ramp for the parah to go on. And the kevesh Shiur Mishtalech. There was also a ramp they built for the Shiur Mishtalech to go out when he took them out to the desert. They would walk out of the temple, and they've made a ramp. Why did they make a ramp? Because it was the scapegoat, they were known to pull out the hairs of the Shiur Mishtalech, and there was a concern they were going to kill the Shiur by accident before they actually throw it off the cliff. And because of that, they built this ramp so that nobody could touch it. It was like, you think about these rock stars and people grabbing at them, and they want to kind of stay in this place where no one can touch them. I mean, some people like being in that, and some people are worried about all the masses getting near them. In any case, you can I don't know why rock star came into my head, but this idea of keeping someone distant so that they don't get touched. So it's this idea here that we want to keep the Shiur Mishtalech far away, so that nobody touches it, okay? And just the person who's taking it out. The lashon sheben karnav, there was this lashon, this white, a red piece of wool that they would put between its horns, and it was a long thing that they would cut in half, and half would stay in the temple, and half would be on his horns. And the idea was when he went off the cliff, and everyone's sins were pardoned, it would turn white, and the one in the mikdash would also turn white. It was a miracle they talk about that happened. And that was to show im yadinu kashanim kasher legelbina, right? If they become red like shani, scarlet, then they will turn white. Your sins, as bad as they can be, they can always be turned white. And that's what happens when we throw them off the cliff. So now the water, so some people say there was a water tunnel that brought water from, I have to remember where this was, right, from Nachal Eitan. It brought it to the temple. It was for cleaning the floors of the temple. So they were always full of blood. So there was this water duct that came through. Chomot ha'ir, the walls of the city, the migdaloteha, the towers, the chol tzarchei ha'ir, and everything needed for the city of Jerusalem. This all serves the temple, basically. So you can use it from this leftover money. Abba Shaul omer, kevesh para, kohanim gdolim osim mishel atzmam. The Kohanim Gdolim, it comes from their funds, the parah, not, okay, they would use their own money. Now, when you finished with all this, and you spent the money on these things, then what would you do with the leftovers? This is a great line. You can start making money off of it. You can buy with it solet, the flour, the oil, and the wine that you needed, store it up, sell it to people who need it, and make a profit on it. And the profits the mikdash. Divrei Rabbi Yishmael. But Rabbi Akiva Omer, he says, no way. You can't use hekdesh to make money. You can't make a profit. It doesn't work that way. Af lo mishel aniyim. And likewise, you can't use tzedakah money to make a profit. Okay, this is interesting. It's like saying you can't invest your tzedakah money. If you have a nonprofit, you can't take the money and invest it in order to make money off of it. Because, right, you can't take that money basically and invest it. It's not really your money to invest. Okay, right? We all know this because, I mean, people do that, but you could lose money on it. And then you're losing tzedakah money. Likewise, you're losing temple money. It could be, what if the wine goes bad? You buy this wine and then you don't sell it. It could go bad. You're actually, it's a problem. Or maybe it's just this idea that this is sanctified. You can't make profit off of sanctified funds. Motar hatruma ma yosima. So there's basically a disagreement about this topic, which again is very interesting disagreement. Motar hatruma ma yosima. What if there was money left? Okay, and most people assume this means we learned that you have to bring the money, this year's sacrifice have to come from this year's money. What if there's money left over at the end of the year? What do you do with it? So we're going to have a machloket about it. You would use it for the gold that would cover the inside of the Kodesh Kodeshim. Rabbi Yishmael Omer, motar perot, ketz hamizbeach. If you have food left over, you sell it for the ketz hamizbeach, for sacrifices that go on the altar. Motar truma leklei sharet. Anything left from the money from the end of last year, you can use to buy the klei sharet, the utensils that were used in the temple. Any of the sanctified utensils that can be used to buy those. Rabbi Akiva Omer, motar truma leketz hamizbeach. Motar nisachim leklei sharet. And he doesn't talk about the motar perot. We'll get to that soon. So motar perot, by the way, I'm sorry, I didn't explain it well. Motar perot is the profits. Remember, Rabbi Yishmael said you can make profits. The profits that you make on the nisachim, right? Let's say you have extra money so you can buy wine and then sell them. So he says those profits go to buying or fixing up the klei sharet, the utensils in the temple that are holy. Rabbi Akiva says motor truma goes to Ketz Mizbech. The extra money from last year, that's used to put sacrifices on the altar, to buy korbanot olah that go on the altar, because he says all that money was given for sacrifices, therefore it has to be used for sacrifices. But for voluntary ones, not for communal, right? Not for the communal obligations, that has to come from the new year, but the old year can go to cover these extra ones. Motar nisachim leklei sharet, leftover nisachim, if you have oil or wine or meal offerings that the flour that you had left over from nisachim, that gets used to buy klei sharet. So you sell it and use the money for the utensils in the temple. Rabbi Chanan Yiskan Kohanim Omer, he holds a little bit like Rabbi Kiva and a little bit Rabbi Yishmael. Motar nisachim ketz hamizbeach. Okay, this neither of them really talked about, neither of them said, which is the nisachim, because they were supposed to go on the altar, they also have to go on the altar. Motar truma leklei sharet, that's like Rabbi Yishmael. And zeh v'zeh lo hayu modim b'perot. But he agrees with Rabbi Akiva. Both of them think that the motar perot, there is no such thing. You can't use motar perot at all. Okay, you can't make a profit off the temple. Kevesh para. So the Gemara starts off and goes in depth about what we were talking about. How much wool is needed for the following things. So Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachman b'shem Rabbanit Yonatan. Gimel l'shonot hayim. There's three wools that you use, this red wool. There's shel seir b'sela. The seir cost a sela, which was the value of 2 shekalim. The seir mishtalech was a 2 shekel one because it had to be split in half, so it needed to be a little more valued. Shel mitzorah b'shekel. The mitzorah also had one of these. You wrap around the azov also this red string, shani always, scarlet, and then they would dip that in the mixture in the blood and whatever. We won't get into the details there, but that gets dipped. The para was double the amount of the seir. It's the most expensive, right? The mitzorah was half the price of the seir, and this is double. And people say it's because it needed, when you put it in the water of the para, when you burnt it all up, and it needed to sink. So because you needed it to sink, therefore it needed to be heavier. So by the way, this isn't the value. It's the weight of it. The weight is the same weight as either, right? The coins were weighted. They had different weights. The more they were valued, the more they weighed. So because of that, right, they say this one has to be heavier than all the others. Rabbi Chunya de Brat Chavran, Rabbi Bar Zavda B'Shem Rabbi Shmuel ben Chalafta said, Shel para b'shtei selaim v'mektzeh. They said the para is actually 2.5, which is going to be the same amount we're going to see now, which is 10 zuz, because the sela was a dinar, and a dinar is 4 zuz, and therefore 2.5 is equal to 10 zuzim. Right? Some people said what he said was 10 zuz, which is the same thing. Rabbi Yehuda b'Shem Rav Shmuel said, Talmidei Chachamim, this is like saying Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel that we see in the Bavli all the time. Talmidei Chachamim hamelamdim et haKohanim hilchot shchita, hilchot kabbalah, hilchot tzlika. This is interesting. The Kohanim have to teach the laws to other people. So the Kohanim that would teach the laws of, my mistake. It was very interesting. The Talmidei Chachamim had to teach the Kohanim the laws. The Kohanim weren't always knowledgeable. So they would hire knowledgeable rabbis to teach the Kohanim how to do things. So if they taught them Hilchot Shchita, Hilchot Kabbalah, how you accept the blood, Hilchot Zrika, you sprinkle the blood, they would get paid from the funds of the temple, the public funds. Rabbi Yitzchak bar Radifa b'Shem Rabbi Imi says, Mevakrei Mumei Kodashim, also people who check the blemishes of the animals in the temple. They also get paid by the Truma Lishka. Rabbi Acha, Rabbi Tanchum bar Chia b'Shem Rabbi Simlai, Megihei Sefer Azara, Notlim Schara Mitrumat Lishka. The people who would edit, who would make sure there was, there's a debate about this, whether it's Sefer Ezra, some people say, or it's Sefer Torah that was in the Azara, that they would use for Hakel, they would use when they read the Kohen Gadol, parts from the Torah, they would use it at different points. It was a token Sefer Torah, and some people say it was a Torah from the time of Moshe. Anyway, the people who would check that book to make sure it was correct, they also get paid. Gida bar Binyamin from the Truma Lishka, from the money that was collected from the Machatzit Shekel. Gida bar Binyamin b'Shem Rabbi Asi, Shnei Dayanei Gzelot Nutlim Schara Mitrumat Halishka. Again, it's unclear what exactly are these Dayanim that deal with stealing. Some people say they come up with the amounts for what fines people have to pay for various things. Shmuel Amar Nashim Ha'orgot B'Parochet Nutlim Schara Mitrumat Halishka. The women who embroider the parochet get money from Truma Halishka. Rabbi Chuna Amar Mitrumat Bedek Habayit. They say, no. You get that from the Bedek Habayit, not, it comes from money that was just donated ran to the upkeep of the temple. That's not the same. These were given to sacrifices. So my palig, what's the machloket? Shmuel avidlaki korban. Some people have a different version, but either which way, it's viewed like a sacrifice because they would sprinkle the blood in some instances on the parochet, and therefore it's like a korban. It's part of the service. Rav Huna avidlaki binyan. He says no, it's part of the building. Amar Rabbi Chizkiah, Tana Rabbi Yehuda. It should be Ben Gudgadot. That was his name. Haktoret v'chol korbanot hatzibur ba'im mitrumat halishka. What else do you use it for? The incense and all the korbanot tzibur. Mizbach hazahav v'kol klei sharei ba'im motar nisachim. The extra nisachim. Again, this is if you have libations and all that leftover wine and oil and other things. What would you do? You would sell that money and it would go for the kli sharei. We saw there were some opinions that said that before, but also for the Mizbach HaZahav, because the Mizbach HaZahav is considered a kli sharei. This was the altar where they put the incense that was inside the Hechal. Mizbach HaOlah v'Hechal v'Azarot, but the other Mizbach where all the sacrifices were brought, and the Hechal, the room where we had the Shulchan and the menorah and the Mizbach HaZahav, and the Azarot, right, the big room where they did the sacrifice, the slaughtering and all that, where the big Mizbach was, Ma'im Misharei Alishka. That already is brought from the leftovers. Okay, why are these two mizbachot different? Because the big mizbach was it was built into the floor. Because of that, it was considered building and not a kli. Whereas the other mizbach was much smaller and it was mobile, and therefore it's considered a utensil, and therefore it came from the motar nisachim, what was left over from the nisachim. Chutz la'azarot ba'im milishkat bedek habayit. Anything outside the azara already then came from the bedek habayit, upkeep of the temple. But wait, there's a bright that says the stones of the altar and the hechal and the azarot, all those stones, moalim bahem, there's a din of mi'ilah. But there is mi'ilah means misuse of consecrated property. If you misuse consecrated property by accident, you're obligated in mi'ilah. You have to bring a korban, asha mi'ilot, and you have to pay the value of what you used plus a fifth. Now, it says that there's no me'ilah in shirayim, and these were used according to what this Braita said, mishayarei halishka, was used from leftover funds. So therefore, how could you say there's me'ilah in leftovers? So what do they say? Elika Rabbi Meir, the Rabbi Meir Amar moalim b'shirayim. We saw this in yesterday's daf. Rabbi Meir says you're moel in shirayim. There is a din of me'ilah b'shirayim, and therefore there could be a din of me'ilah here, and therefore it's not, even if it's brought from the shirayim, there is me'ilah. Amar Rabbi Chia, klum amar Rabbi Meir, ela b'toch shnato. Hacha chutz l'shnato ana kaimin. Says you don't even need Rabbi Meir here to say that, because Rabbi Meir said, this is a question on this. He says, how could that possibly be? Because Rabbi Meir, we asked a question about shirayim. We said, oh, don't worry, it's Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir holds there is me'ilah in shirayim. But he says, this stuff that was built, when you use it, it was most likely from the previous year's funds, which are already not this year's. He only says there's me'ilah in shirayim from this year. But this is most likely, and even if it's maybe from this year, the majority of the stones are, and it's batel, it's kind of, right, this was built a while ago. This isn't really called shirayim, and he shouldn't say there's me'ilah. So we're left with a question, really, how could this be? Amar Rabbi Chizkiah, Tana Rabbi Yehuda ben Gudgadot, another bright of his, Hashulchan v'anoah v'mizbachot v'parochet ma'akvin et hakorbanot. If you have a problem with one of these things, okay, any of these things not being, if any of them become pasul, they become disqualified for some reason, it prevents the korbanot from being sacrificed. Divrei Rabbi Meir. Chachamim omrim, ein lecha ma'akev et hakorban, ela, now it says akior v'akem bilvad, but the nusach has changed to akarkov v'akerem bilvad. The sovev, okay, there's different opinions what karkov is. I'll explain it according to one opinion. It's the sovev, which was this part midway in the altar, which jutted out one amma around each side, and people would walk on there, and the kohanim would use that as a space to work on. That and the kranot, the four corners at the top, those are the only things that can mess up the korbanot. If anything else is disqualified, it's fine. You could still do the sacrifices. The loken amar Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Yossi ben Chananya. They didn't agree with this. Trehon amrin kol hein dichtiv nochach ma'akev. Sela eno ma'akev. Okay, now we're going to go through based on the verses in the Torah. They say it depends on what words we use for each one. Okay, so one says, if it says nochach, okay, this is the, I just want to double check. This was the shulch, right? It's the menorah. The menorah, okay, is nochach. Okay, it says there, et menorah nochach hashulchan al tzela mishkan teimana. So the menorah is nochach hashulchan. The word nochach appears there That's wherever it says nochach, that's ma'akev. So the menorah is ma'akev, but nothing else. Tsela eino ma'akev. But if it says tsela, like the shulchan, because it says hashulchan titen al tsela tzafon, right? That is not preventing the korbanot. If there's something wrong with that, it's fine. But Amar Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachman, he says, b'shem Rabbi Yonatan va'afilu tsela ma'akev. Even tsela is ma'akev, okay, which would then include the menorah and the shulchan. Okay, and then we'll continue tomorrow into seeing another opinion about this, and then we'll try to resolve how this all fits in. Stop here for today. Have a great day, everyone. Moadim l'simcha.